Richard Nixon surrounds himself with mementos. Pictures of Mrs. Nixon happy in China, of his 4 grandchildren, 1 by daughter Tricia and 3 by daughter Julie. His eldest granddaughter Jenny, the image of her mother, in an Easter hat purchased by Nixon. A piano player and his fans. On a corner table, time stands still. Old magazines with pictures of the Nixons during their White House days. In these unpretentious surroundings, we talked about President Reagan's visit this week to the cemetery at Bitburg.
Sir, would this have happened in your administration? I guess what I'm asking is, how does a thing like this happen? You've been in the White House. How do you get into this situation of such mistakes?
Well, I must say I've made my mistakes, as we're quite aware, and ones that were much more devastating from a personal standpoint than this is going to be to President Reagan. These things happen sometimes. What has happened here is it's a tragedy of basically misunderstandings, misconceptions, tragedy of errors, perhaps. But once Chancellor Kohl did it, gave the invitation, once President Reagan accepted it, then for Chancellor Kohl to withdraw it, apparently he was not willing to do that because he thought it would hurt him at home. And for President Reagan to say then, whatever you do, Chancellor, I'm not coming, I think it would have a devastating effect on him.
Why?
Well, because, let's face it, as you look at the Germans today, they are the strongest ally we've got in Europe. Without Germany, NATO is nothing. Germany is the only European nation that the Russians fear. Without the Germans, there is no way you could hold the line in Western Europe. No way. Unless you nuke them.
Did you call the president, or did he call you?
No, having been in that office, I don't call him. He calls me, usually. And in this instance, the call came from Don Regan's office from him, asked for my advice about the thing.
Sir, do you talk to the White House on a regular basis?
No. I generally prefer to send my advice when it's requested in writing. You know, I find that unless you discipline yourself to write, you talk too much.
May I ask if you have been invited to the White House? And if you were, to a state dinner or something, would you go?
Well, of course, we were invited to the White House on the occasion of when the 3 presidents made that historic trip to Sadat's funeral.
Yes.
We have not been invited to a social engagement since, but I don't think it's any affront. And as far as going is concerned, you know, President Reagan made a very interesting comment. He went up when the environmentalists in California, the Sierra Club, were after him about doing something about the sequoias. He said, well, when you've seen one sequoia, you've seen them all. And I could say that when you've seen one state dinner, you've seen them at all. We have no particular desire to go back again.
Let us now turn our attention, sir, to the Soviet Union. The Russians have refused to apologize for the shooting death of Major Nicholson in East Germany, and yet we talk about a summit. What should we do?
There will be a summit during President Reagan's second term, and there should be. But it is one that should be well prepared. As I have put it, when the 2 powers meet, there's going to be enormous attention paid to it. And a summit, if I may paraphrase, cannot labor and produce a mouse. Let's disabuse ourselves of this sort of silly notion. Wouldn't it be wonderful if Gorbachev and Reagan could just get together and meet each other and know each other? Because each would charm the other. We would find that our differences weren't all that great. And then after they had completed the meeting, they would shake hands and go home and live happily ever afterwards.
Baloney,
now that doesn't happen even with friends, and it seldom does. And it certainly doesn't happen with potential adversaries. What we're really saying here, the tension between the United States and the Soviet Union is not a problem to which there's a solution. The tension which exists between our 2 countries is a permanent condition. It can be alleviated, but it cannot be cured.
What do you think of the president's decision to have an embargo against Nicaragua?
I support it. I do not think that will be adequate in terms of getting the Nicaraguans to cut their ties to the Soviet bloc, getting them to give up some of the repression.
Won't it push them even further into the Soviet arms?
The same argument was made, Barbara, you recall, I'm sure I'm old enough to recall, the same argument was made with Castro. I was around in 1959.
And it did
And
push him
what
down.
happened is that Castro didn't need a push. He was already there. The idea that Ortega, this very intelligent, very tough fellow who was over giving an abrazo to Mr. Gorbachev, will be pushed into the Soviet arms is ridiculous. He is a dedicated Marxist-Leninist, just as Castro was. And as far as that's concerned, the idea that if we follow policies that are too tough with him, he's going to become more pro-Soviet is ridiculous. He's there already. Let me make one thing clear. I do not think that our goal should be to overthrow the government. That isn't going to happen. The Contras aren't strong enough to do that. Our goal should be to bring enough pressure on that government that they, in their own interest, will have no choice but to give up on their foreign adventures.
When you wrote in your book about Vietnam, you said we won't get over the Vietnam syndrome until we stop using this intellectual junk food. What do you mean by intellectual junk food?
By intellectual junk food, what I was referring to was the whole orgy that we have been exposed to in the past few weeks. You know, I watch a little more television than I used to. As you know, it's not my favorite medium, and I'm not their favorite.
Just give the news, please.
But on the other hand, I would say that as far as that is concerned, we have been inundated with this hand-wringing about Vietnam, and we see these happy Vietnamese women, girls riding their bicycles through Ho Chi Minh City, and we hear how wonderful it is there and so forth. We hear that as a result of our leaving, that now things are moving better. Well, they're not. Now, what I mean is that that's intellectual junk food. What we have to do is to hear the truth about what has happened, and then we will realize that we must not let that happen again, not in Nicaragua or anyplace else.
Since you brought it up, sir, why don't you like television?
Well, television is a medium that I think, in terms of the kind of discussion we have now, is not one that allows for the kind of really consideration and depth that we need. Mm-hmm. Now, your program does it to an extent, but you're the first to admit that if you were to ask me now, what do you think about Star Wars, Mr. President? I can't answer in 1 minute. I could, but it would be, frankly, intellectual junk food. It wouldn't be a real substantive answer. As you know, the attention span is very small. In fact, I'm probably being cut off now because I'm talking too long.
You may very well be. I'll go on to the next question. I cannot sit with you and not talk about politics because it's just too much fun to do it with you. Look ahead, if you will, with me and tell me what you see as the winning ticket for the Republicans. Winning presidential ticket for the Republicans.
The way I look at 1988 is this. At the present time, if the economy holds up and is good in 1988, George Bush will be nominated and he will be elected. If the economy does not hold up, George Bush will go down with Reagan's popularity, and then there will be someone else.
Kemp?
Possibly Jack Kemp,
yeah.
Provided Jack Kemp is able to separate himself from the Reagan policies, which would be difficult, because I don't think he would want to do that, because I think he believes in the Reagan policies. But if the economy goes down, then you would probably see a Democrat winning. As far as the second spot in the ticket is concerned, I think you're more likely to see a woman on the Republican ticket than on the Democratic ticket. The Democrats have tried and been burned. Now, that is no reflection on Mrs. Ferraro. It just happened she ran at the wrong time on the wrong ticket. Mondale was going to lose anyway, but as far as the Republicans are concerned, they'll be writing on a blank page. And the Republicans are weaker among women than they should be. I think the possibility of a Republican, be it either Bush or Kemp, picking a woman is quite high.
Jean Kirkpatrick, everybody's saying perfect choice, vice presidential candidate.
She is certainly eloquent, and she has great support among the conservatives, the hawks, and among the Republicans.
You think it's a good idea?
The question, I can answer that question better to see how she conducts herself when she gets out there under the fire of the press and so forth in non-foreign policy issues. Nobody knows how you run on that fast course until you've been there. I would say at the present time, Mrs. Dole would perhaps have a better chance even than Jean Kirkpatrick. Now, do you want to go to the Democrats?
Sure.
I would say first that Gary Hart I thought after hearing him at the Democratic Convention that he was finished because it was sour grapes. But he conducted himself very well during the campaign. He has recovered. He is a formidable candidate for the nomination. In his case, however, some way he's got to warm up. He just doesn't seem to have the warmth that he comes through too cold to me. And this is no pun, he really needs a heart transplant. I think, however, that the man that is most likely to be nominated is Cuomo. If he wins a landslide victory in New York, which I think he will, then he will be very hard to stop.
What about Ted Kennedy?
Well, I know that he's slimming down again for a race, but the trouble is he's running in the wrong direction. He is the last hurrah of the old Democratic establishment. I don't think he's going to make it.
I'd like to talk just a bit about you, sir. Your books have been very successful now. Your opinions in foreign policy are being sought after by leaders in this country and elsewhere. It seems to be, in a sense, the resurrection of Richard Nixon. Does that help to heal the wounds? How does it make you feel?
Yeah. Well, I'm not holding my breath for the resurrection. As far as the public reaction is concerned, I realize that I have a lot of people out there who, as has been the case throughout my political career, who are very strongly antagonistic. I have some that are very supportive. And at the present time, I appreciate the one and respect the other. That's what you do as you get a little older. And as I sit here today, 10 years after the end of Vietnam, almost 12 years since they left the presidency, I'm just thankful that I'm still alive and able to conduct an intelligent conversation with a very tough questioner.
How are you feeling, sir? We heard you had shingles and bad virus.
I'm afraid this is going to disappoint all of my enemies out there because I'm afraid I'm going to outlive them.
How is Mrs. Nixon feeling?
Well, as I know she's one of your favorites.
Yes,
She's quite a remarkable person. I speak of what I've been through, but you know, for a woman to suffer in silence during the difficult last days in the White House and the days thereafter, which were even worse, is much more difficult. And then she's had 2 strokes. If you were to see her, you wouldn't know she'd had a stroke, but she doesn't have the stamina she once did.
How would you like to be remembered?
I suppose everyone would like to be remembered particularly for his major achievements. Most people would point, for example, to the opening to China, which changed the world. But as I look back during the White House years, I think, for example, of an initiative which many people have forgotten, the cancer initiative. You remember we started that in 1971, and it was brought home to me just a couple of days ago. My brother, Don, has cancer. It's a very serious case. He's now taking radiation and chemotherapy. 10 years ago, his doctor told him he would be dead. So that initiative may have helped prolong his life and the life of other cancer patients. What I'm suggesting here is that we all think of, well, he went to China. He ended the war in Vietnam. He opened relations with the Soviet Union through détente. But in my view, if the cancer initiative, which we began, could save lives, that'd be worth all the rest put together.
Hugh, who would imagine that what he would want to be remembered for the most was his research on cancer?
Yes,
That's
having
surprising.
nothing to do with politics.
Foreign policy, yeah.
Surprise. Many people will remember your first interview with Richard Nixon in the early morning at a time when networks didn't do that unless it was on a pool basis, and you got one alone with him.
It's a while ago.
You've had a chance to observe the man now because you've done other interviews in between. In what ways do you perceive that he has changed since then?
When you've got nothing to lose, you can afford to be very outspoken. This is a mellow Richard Nixon.
Do you feel that he's rehabilitated?
In terms of his foreign policy, whoever thought that 10 years ago after Watergate anybody would ask his opinion on anything? When it comes to foreign policy, he is respected, maybe because that's our foreign policy is in somewhat of a vacuum. But in general, he still has his enemies. One thing, though, he's always interesting to talk to.
Indeed so. Thank you, Barbara.